No worries, no worries. I am pretty sick of this cold.
We
COVID.
are live. Welcome, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Supply Chain Solutions Weekly Ship Show. Today is August 18th, 2022, and this is episode number 32 in our Ship Show series for 2022 that keeps you informed of the changing market conditions, emerging trends, and best practices in a volatile time of geopolitical intrigue, supply chain disruption, and inflation. As always, it's my pleasure to welcome my Ship Show co-host, Jason Brand, our Director of Business Development, who joins me each week on our broadcast. And finally, my name is Anthony D'Ambrosio. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Supply Chain Solutions, the company that always delivers value quickly, affordably, and flawlessly. And lastly, we'd like to give a shout out to our amazing Director of Marketing, Vanessa Fry, for producing today's show. So we've got a great show this week, folks. And I think with all the saber rattling recently by both China and the USA, I believe the timing is right to discuss and ask the question, what happens if China invades Taiwan, and how would this affect global supply chains? But before we do, let's just pause a moment and remember the great people of Ukraine as they struggle for their freedom. Thank you, everyone. So let's talk about the Taiwan-China relationship. Taiwan has been self-governing for more than 70 years and has never been under the rule of communist China, but Beijing considers the island its territory. And the Chinese government views any official visits by Taiwan by senior politicians from other countries as a provocation. So, excuse me, if an actual kinetic military war occurs between China and Taiwan, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties, heaven forbid, and Taiwan left in ruins, how would this affect global supply chains? I imagine that the global chip shortage will be severely damaged if TSMC and other tech companies in Taiwan were destroyed in the process. So with that, it makes me think of a couple questions that I'd like to ask Jason. So Jay, could it put all global technological progress back a few years, do you think?
100% chance. 100%.
Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, totally agree. And would Apple, Tesla, Volkswagen, Volvo, Nike still be able to operate as before?
No chance.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jay. And lastly, would international firms be forced to pull out of China market? And would it be business as usual?
Yeah, that one gets a little tricky, I think. Definitely not business as usual. We think about the whole situation that happened over the past years in the pandemic. And I mean, so much of this was that we experienced started on that Trans-Pacific lane. So imagine if there's a Grace Swan event happening in that lane. I mean, definitely not business as usual, but yeah.
No, thank you, Jay. I mean, I agree with you 100%. So, I'm sure this is a little sauce for the goose, folks. I mean, kind of gives you the flavor of really the domino effect that can happen should this, like I said, heaven forbid, happen. But these are just a few of the questions that come to mind when we consider the ramifications of conflict with China over Taiwan. So let's put it in perspective. One of the world's busiest shipping lanes sits right between Taiwan and China, and the escalating tensions involving the island are causing concerns for an already strained global supply chain. So if Vanessa, which she is always awesome, has that little slide up, as you can see, here's the Strait of Taiwan. And you can see, I mean, it's not very big, but 40% of global commerce in the Asia Pacific Rim goes through this little strait between China and Taiwan. So with that being said, it's important to note that almost half of the world's container ships and 88% of the world's largest ships by tonnage have passed through the narrow strait through the narrow Taiwan Strait this year. And further, An historic visit to Taiwan's capital, Taipei, by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the country's third highest ranking government official, infuriated China just about a week ago. And Beijing responded with threatening military exercises, which included firing a missile over Taiwan for the first time ever and simulating invasion plans. So as a result of this, trade delays are now expected as some ships choose to avoid the route, with rerouting of vessels through the eastern side of the island, adding a few days of voyages. So, these container ships and whether it's a bulk carrier, a tanker, a container ship, they're already rerouting, So, and it's important to note that it's difficult to forecast the degree of impact of global trade, but we expect trade disruptions across Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan if military action takes place. And the global supply chain is really interconnected, and all the major stretches like Taiwan Strait is sort of a nerve center for these value chains. And if any one is stretched or blocked, the undercurrents of this are going to be felt all across the ecosystem of supply chain. So it's really a very scary situation. So think of it this way. Even if you're going from America to Australia, you usually go via the South China Sea because there are other trade reasons to do that. For example, you want to drop containers off, you want to pick containers up, etc. So even if your final destination is in China, a lot of ships go via the South China Sea, and a big chunk of those go through that little strait between Taiwan and China. Now, the biggest concern for global supply chain is the disruption to the manufacturing of integrated circuits, essentially microchips, which would have huge consequences to many, if not all, industries, okay? And Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the TSMC, which we talked about earlier, is the world's largest contract manufacturer of the chips, which are used to power everyday items, including phones and laptops, cars, watches, refrigerators across the world. And it's interesting to note that TSMC just opened a chip plant in Arizona, okay? So, again, it's a little bit of a dichotomy there, but currently, we currently know that there is a supply problem worldwide with microchips already, because we're seeing delays of it up to 12 months just for ordering a new car, mainly because of microchips. And there are thousands and thousands of cars out there around the world that are almost completed in production, but they're waiting for some microchips, and they can't take them to market because of that. But should war break out, supply chain issues will really be among the least of the world's problems, but it will be a problem nonetheless. And if things escalate between China and Taiwan, or between China and the US over Taiwan, any disruption to the world's supply of microchips would have huge implications. And if the supply of microchips were interrupted, that's going to have a massive impact on the world. And while no nation wants to see the supply of microchips stop, including China, if a conflict was to break out, it could be a reality we face. And in a military conflict, there's really no exports coming out of Taiwan, and there's no microchips coming out of Taiwan, and of course, no one wants to see a conflict, first and foremost. But from a supply chain perspective, I'm not so much worried about the world's 40% of trade that goes through the area, the Taiwan Strait. I'm more worried about, very specifically, a couple of those ships sort of sneaking out of the Taiwan Strait and taking Taiwanese microchips out to the rest of the world. Because if we all were students of our history from World War II, we saw that many Nazi submarines sunk supply ships all over the world. So, there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of dominoes here that could happen. But to some extent, and you know what, Jason, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I want
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
dive into something because it's the perfect time. So I want to take a little deep dive before we jump into some of the logistics portions of this, because I mean, there is obviously, as we're going over, a substantial logistics, excuse me, I'm a little bit sick today. Some of my words are not flowing with me, but there is obviously a very strategic logistic position that Taiwan is in. But I do want to talk about chips a little bit more. And so I just need to emphasize how big the Taiwan semiconductor industry is compared to the rest of the world, because you've got the top 4 companies that produce semiconductors, and they account for 85% of the global market share. Just 4 companies. 2 of those companies are in Taiwan. And as Anthony said before, that largest company is the TSMC, and it accounts for nearly 60% of the market share, but the top 4 are accounting for 85% of the market share. And I want to emphasize some of these numbers because, TSMC, they also span other areas as well. I've seen that number substantially higher when they're talking about really chipset market share. So that's important to keep in mind. But another thing that's important to talk about Taiwan and really that region is, like, Taiwan is not only one of the largest, it's not only the largest manufacturer of these chips, they're also one of the most advanced manufacturers of these chips. So they've got techniques that, you can actually go over to South Korea as well, but TSMC and Samsung, the top 2 spots, they are able to now, just as of this year, produce these 3 nanometer microchips. And these are going to be critical, very, very critical for us right now, especially given the huge imbalance between demand and supply. But they're the only 2 suppliers in the market at this moment that can. And actually, they just started shipping back, I believe, July 30th. So we'll start to see those in products as soon as the Apple event that comes out later this year. But I think when you think about where this market share is centralized, there are a couple takeaways you have to keep in mind, and you've got to strategically think about. So, first, you've got to understand that Taiwan, or more specifically, the Taiwan-owned TSMC, they own a super majority of the market, and they've actually been referred to as the company that runs the world. And, in a way, you need to view semiconductors and the steady supply of them coming from Taiwan and South Korea and that region to the US as kind of a mirror image of the situation in Russia, with Russian oil supplying the energy demands of the EU as well. Both are hypercritical to our economies. So you've got to keep that in mind. And, Taiwan's in this unique situation where they are these market leaders because of some great business decisions they made early on. But, it's very important to note. So keep that in mind.
Well, Jason, that is spot on. And again, everyone, I want to thank Jason for being able to join today, because I think you tested positive for CV-19, right?
Yeah, I'm at the end of it, but I'm not feeling great.
Yeah, thank you so much. It means so much to all of us. But as Vanessa has this slide up here, which I found that I thought was amazing, just to give you a perspective, as you can see here in the light blue, these are all the territorial waters of Taiwan. But then you could see when China essentially did their live fire military exercises, they simulated invading the island. So all these little purple areas are all their invasion forces and how they would actually invade the island. So the United States military was able to pick up this satellite imagery. And as we all know, you could probably find anything on the internet. And of course, we were able to find this slide to really illustrate, how they would invade the island. But I think what's really important to understand is that to some observers, the acute supply chain crisis that has followed in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic is really a sign of poor planning, lack of resilience, lack of surge capacity, and industry rigidity. And inflation, too, is really having a major impact and will inevitably lead to some supply chain reconfigurations. And I can tell you right now, folks, even though rates are trending down now because of the inflation, and even though there's isolated pockets of congestion around the world and around the country, and some things have cleared quayside here in the US, I do believe, as Jason and I predicted earlier in the beginning of the year when we talked about the 2022 market outlook, that there would be a container market correction of at least 30 to 40%. So while I don't think that the rates will go down to pre-pandemic levels, supply chain has irrevocably, been changed, and, I think that higher interest rates mean that the cost of higher inventory levels it's becoming material very quickly, and it pressures companies to go back to that older, leaner model of just-in-time shipping versus built to stock. And a few weeks ago, Jason and I talked about demand planning and buffer stock. And just on a quick side note, before the pandemic, all of the companies around the world and in the United States had buffer stock, a reserve of inventory. So then we open up from the lockdowns but while the lockdowns are occurring, people are ordering online, everything is, e-commerce, and the inventory is being depleted. So then when we open up, companies can't replenish their inventory quick enough. And then throughout last year, as we started to catch up, companies over-ordered, and now they have too much inventory and not the right inventory. So it's part of that dynamic of supply chain being changed irrevocably. But I think structural shifts matter too, including the rising cost in mainland China of doing business. Labor is going up, their population is aging actually, and I just read a great study from the University of Pennsylvania's business school, the Wharton School, about how the working population in China is aging, and China really doesn't know if they will ever be able to produce as much as they used to before the pandemic, because of that aging population. And a lot of the younger people aren't going to work in these different into these different factories. But as I said, though, these structural shifts matter too, and China is the world's manufacturing powerhouse, and the over-concentration of freight with just 10 companies that control 85% of the global container capacity is just out of control. We all know that is the container ship cartel, as I like to refer to them as, these few alliances that really have a monopoly. So I think globalization handed down a system that seemed efficient until it was tested by the multidimensional crises of the last 2 years, the pandemic, Ukraine, other geopolitical events. So corporate and market thinking is unlikely to remain the same. So in industry after industry, C-suites and C-level executives are planning for a world of disruption as we move forward, unfortunately. And at a minimum, companies aim to build resilience and redundancy into the supply chain. And that's sort of the new norm now. But there's really another factor, and that's the political risk that is complicating planning right now, especially in technology-intensive industries. And that risk has put a brake on easy, straightforward solutions, like building extra capacity in China, for example. Specifically, the emergence of multidimensional strategic competition between Beijing and Washington has interrupted the flow of goods, capital, people, technology, and data. So as we wind down here and get to a few best practices, these geopolitical disruptions look set to become a long-term structural trend as we move into 2023. So, we'll ask Jason if he's got any other comments before we go into the one part of our presentation that talks about, so what can you do should Taiwan go the way of Ukraine and conflict breaks out? Are there any strategies or best practices to follow? But before we jump into this last portion, let's ask Jason if he has anything else he'd like to add.
Yeah, there's a lot of little things, right? And but let's go into the best practices, because I think we can some of the things I'm thinking I can bake right into those, or even into a question.
Thank you, Jay. So a couple of those best practices, strategy number one is inventory and capacity buffers. And I was just talking about buffer stock early, okay? So buffer capacity is the most straightforward way to enhance your company's resilience, whether in the form of underutilized production facilities or inventory in excess of safety stock requirements. And the challenge is that buffers are expensive. No one really wants to tie up capital in excessive inventory, and supply chain leaders may have a hard time justifying that to their C-level suite executives within their companies. But it's something everybody has to really focus on more so than ever. That's why a few weeks ago, Jason and I did a show and we talked about the demand planning, okay, and the forecasting and how you need to look at your point of sale to see how that's going to reflect against your demand planning. But you know, this is all leading companies to use buffers in the form of surge capacity for new product launches or expansions of new growth areas. So organizations can also create buffer capacity by using contract manufacturers strategically for their surge needs. And Jason, please just, you know, jump in whenever you need to. Strategy number two would be manufacturing network diversification. So in response to the US-China trade war, Ukraine, and other geopolitical events, many companies have begun to diversify their sourcing or manufacturing bases. And for some, this has meant switching to new suppliers outside China or asking existing partners to supply them from elsewhere in Asia or in other countries such as Mexico. And you know, disruptions to supply chain operations have also really intensified in the past few years. So this means that the cost of retaining multiple supply locations must be seen more as a cost of doing business rather than an inefficiency. And just to give you a side example, we have a huge client that had about 90% of their cargo coming out of China. And then over the last 2.5 years, they diversified, and some of their plants in China just happen to have operations in Vietnam and Myanmar. And even though there's a lot of political upheaval in Myanmar at times, they diversified a little bit. So now only 60% of their supplies, of their components are coming out of China. So they diversified a little bit, and it's been good for them. And it was also a way for them to get away from some of the tariff exclusions from some years ago. So the third strategy is multi-sourcing. So it's a big span here. So from 2011 to 2020, there were a lot of natural disasters in Japan, in Thailand. There were geopolitical events that disrupted supply chains across the world and really exposed companies' reliance on single sources of supply chain, okay, or suppliers. For example, in the automotive industry, nearly finished cars could not be shipped to customers in the last couple of years because of missing and often expensive components. Some of those are chips, some of them are not. But sourcing is an obvious way by diversifying your sourcing to mitigate the risk. And supply chain solutions, as we've always said to everyone, doesn't just move the freight from point to point. We connect people to people, and we have a vast array of resources around the world that can help you source other suppliers through our people and our practices. So I think crafting a multi-source strategy, supply chain leaders, have to know that their supplier networks in detail, and have to be able to categorize the suppliers, not just by their spend, but also by the revenue impact if a disruptive event occurs. So diversification can be achieved by awarding business to additional suppliers or working with an existing single or sole source supplier from another area of the world that is also able to produce out of several locations and still meet your specifications. And then, of course, we talked about this last year, Jason and I, near sourcing, best sourcing, and resourcing, but near sourcing. And we're seeing a big trend in that right now. So beyond multi-sourcing, some companies want to reduce geographic dependence in their global networks and shorten cycle times for finished products. And regional or local supply chains can be more expensive, but they also add more players and complexity to the ecosystem. But at the same time, they allow for more control over inventory and moving the product closer to the end consumer. And then finally, the last two would be strategy number 5 would be platform, product, or plant harmonization. So what does that mean? The more regionalized the network, the more harmonized plant technology has to be to allow products to move seamlessly across their networks. A great example of this is what happened in World War II. Now, manufacturing was a lot simpler then, but we saw tire companies start retooling and they started building tanks. Okay, so the use of common vehicle platforms for a variety of models in the automotive industry is one well-established example of such harmonization. And so standardizing your components across multiple products, particularly those that are not visible or important to the customer, is another form of harmonization. So this really simplifies sourcing policies and creates opportunities to place higher volumes among multiple suppliers, which in turn helps enhance your resiliency. And lastly, our last sort of strategy or best practice that we'd like to pass on is really developing an ecosystem of partnerships. The COVID-19 crisis has shown the need to have a diversified approach to sourcing. So, at the same time, however, collaboration with strategic raw material suppliers and external service partners is also vital to ensure better preparedness and resiliency for the future. And for companies without a scale to support multiple locations of their own, strong relationships with contract manufacturers and global 3PLs like Supply Chain Solutions can be vital in diversifying production and distribution to different countries. And data really shows, finally, that around half of supply chain organizations are either using external manufacturers or exploring how they can support product moves, with a similar proportion engaging logistics partners for this purpose. So, in closing, folks, I still think we're going to be headed for a lot of volatility as we move into 2023. It's going to be a wild ride. And this is why you have to have a strategic partner like Supply Chain Solutions, who always has the same in-stake as you do in your supply chain. And I know Jason's probably going to have a few final comments as we finish up.
Yeah. Anthony, fantastic job. Seriously. So a couple things, we are not in the same terrible situation we used to be, right? There's some glimmers of hope here. When you look at, obviously, your ocean rates coming into the West Coast right now, they're substantially better than they used to be because there is capacity available. Also, we saw air rates do the deepest dive in as far as demand goes month over month, just between June and July this year. So, as we're approaching some of these new product launches, obviously by Apple and others, and we're coming up to, when electronic sales go through the roof, when we're in peak season, when we're in Black Friday, and we're approaching, Christmas and things like that, at least we have capacity. And then when we start to think about some of these solutions, nearshoring really sticks out to me because, so in the beginning of the pandemic, when some of these supply constraints were really harming US businesses and other businesses, Apple and others basically convinced TSMC to diversify where the locations were, get out of just Taiwan. Anthony mentioned that they were going to be building a plant in China, but they're also building a plant in Japan. They're also building, Anthony, you mentioned the plant in the US.
In Arizona, that's correct.
Yes, you mentioned the US one, and they're building one actually in China. They're also building one in Japan. And I believe there's actually a second one they're considering building in the US as well. But the issue with these plants are they're really expensive and they take a really long time to build because they're very complex. And so, it's great to see that ball rolling, but it's too bad the ball wasn't rolling sooner. So, but it is also a glimmer of hope. If we still were in a situation where TSMC, the largest by market share chip creator, was just in Taiwan, these situations involving China and Taiwan would be, I think, a lot more scary. Thankfully, we've got Samsung in second place, and they are showing that they have similar technology, but they just don't have the market share. They don't have the production capability, so we can't rely on them. But there are some glimmers of hope, so to keep that in mind.
And that's it for today, folks. Back to our amazing director of marketing, Vanessa, to see if we have any questions.
Hello, everyone. Yes, we do have a question. It's in the queue, and I'm going to read for you. Hello, Jason, Anthony, and Vanessa. A conflict between Communist China and the Republic of China, besieged Taiwan, can force the use of One Belt, One Road from China? And that is our question.
Jay, do you want to take add your essence, or?
I think I'll start, and then I think you got to finish it because I think you'll have a great.
Okay.
So
sounds like a plan.
I think it really, if that happens, the big concern is how the world reacts. So if the same thing happens, to China that happened to Russia, and all these sanctions start getting put on China, then the one road it's obviously was a really interesting idea. I mean, the busiest lane in the entire world for ocean shipping goes by Taiwan. It's going from Asia to Europe, busiest lane in the whole world for ocean shipping. So being able to supplement that lane by doing the one road was a great idea, but it's just, based on where it's connecting and based on where it's going through, it's in dicey territory. So will people still be supplying from China, or will they try to supply the raw materials from India? But it's also a different geopolitical sphere. So it's another unknown, right? You kind of see alignment between those countries, is along with, obviously, there are conflicts, but yeah. I know that's a little bit of a middle of the road answer, but Anthony, what do you?
No, it's a good answer, Jay. I mean, it's a complicated question, but just to recap how the One Belt, One Road works. I mean, initially it was announced in the year 2013, with the purpose of restoring the ancient Silk Route that connected Asia to Europe. And I think that, if my memory serves me correct, the project scope has been expanded over years to include new territories and development initiatives. And, they call it the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. And the project really involves building a big network of roadways, railways, and maritime ports, power grids, oil and gas pipelines, all associated with infrastructure projects. And the project really covered two parts. The first was called the Silk Road Economic Belt, which was primarily land-based and was expected to connect China with Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. But the second is also called the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which is sort of a sea-based initiative, and it is expected by China to connect the southern coast of the Mediterranean and Africa and Southeast Asia and Central Asia. So, the names are confusing, as the belt is actually a network of roads and the road is the sea route, right? So, I mean, listen, it's a very complicated question, and I just think that it's a great question, but it's something that we're really going to have to follow closely from week to week right now, really keep our finger on the pulse of this. And please do not hesitate to reach out to Vanessa, Jason, myself, should you have any questions. And don't forget, next week, it's all about the FMR, the Freight Market Roundup, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the show next week. Any other comments, guys?
Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Thank you, Anthony and Jason, for joining. Thank you, everyone. You'll be getting that follow-up email later today. Make it a great day, right, Anthony?
Make it a great day. Feel better, Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye now.